I'm Paul Sullivan, your host on the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, sublime, strange, and silly aspects of being a lead dad in a world where men, who are the go-to parents, often feel they have to hide or at least not talk about their roles. One thing I know from personal experience is being a lead dad is not a traditional role for men, whether you work full-time, part-time, or devote all of your time to your family. Parenting is so often left to mothers or paid caregivers. But here at the Company of Dads, our goal is to shake all that off and create a community for fathers who are lead dads and to welcome other dads who want to learn more from them. Today, my guest is Arthrell, a longtime consultant for Deloitte, where he worked in both corporate strategy and something called human-centered design. More on that later. He's a father of two. A year after the first was born, he took time off from work to care for their daughter as his wife returned to her job. The experience informed the way he looked at consulting, which at its core is trying to help companies improve how they operate. The result was a project he led for Deloitte that resulted in a paper called The Design of Everyday Men Report. Key finding? Inclusive work cultures outperform in terms of both financial performance and innovation. Recently, Eric left consulting to start a company with his wife, Erin, called Moosh, which makes bamboo tissue. I asked him to come on the podcast because of the important research paper he co-authored, but also because I want to hear how he nimbly moved around the world of work and family. Eric, welcome to the Company of Dads podcast.
Hi, Paul. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, let's very quickly let's get the elephant in the room. What is human-centered design, and how does it relate to the research you did around fathers?
Yeah, for sure. So when I was at Deloitte, I was working for a subsector of Deloitte called Doblin. And Doblin is a human-centered design and innovation consulting practice. And in a nutshell, human-centered design is trying to understand human behaviors and how those humans interact with products and services so you can design the best products and services for those humans. And so the fundamental difference between sort of your traditional corporate strategy approach or a human-centered design approach is that human-centered design always starts with what is desirable. What do people actually want? How does that fit into their lives? What kind of problems are they facing, and how can we solve those problems? And to do that, you actually need to take a very in-depth research approach. And so with human-centered design, we would go really, really deep with a small number of people to best understand their behaviors and their wants and their needs. And through doing that really deep research, we can develop insights which can lead to new products and services or updating a certain product or service to make sure that we're best meeting those human needs.
Is it fair to say, and kind of to give a concrete example for our listeners, fair to say, like, instead of designing a chair without talking to any people of different shapes and sizes, you might first talk to those people of different shapes and sizes and see what they want in a chair? Is that kind of a good way to put it?
Exactly. And so there's many layers to this human-centered design conversation. And so the layer that I would put on that is that when you're designing a chair, you're thinking about how the person sits down on that chair and how they get into the chair and how they get out of that chair. But you're also thinking of, where does that chair sit within the room that it's in? Where does that room sit within the house? Where does that house sit within the neighborhood? Where does that neighborhood sit within the city? And so you're considering all these levels of context when you're designing that chair. So it's not necessarily just about, having the right tweaks and features that make the chair really usable. It's about understanding the whole experience around it.
This is for listeners, this is an incredible segue into what we're going to discuss today, because before the pandemic, that chair sat in an office somewhere. And if you're a consultant at Deloitte, maybe it sat at your Deloitte office, or maybe it sat at your client's office. Now that chair, where does it sit? Does it sit in a cafe? Does it sit in your home office? Does it sit somewhere else? And so that's, it's a big shift. And, in the report, you talk about the culture, and this report was written just slightly before the pandemic, a little bit before the pandemic, but you talk about back then, that one of the things that was really difficult for men wanting to do more for their families was this always on, always available culture, i.e. that chair was in the office and you were supposed to be
Mhm.
in that chair. Do you think this got worse or better during the pandemic and, where we are now, which, some people are calling the next normal?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And so when the pandemic was first hitting, I was working within a diversity, equity, and inclusion part of Deloitte. And that was one of the main questions that we asked ourselves, is that now that we're all working from home, what is work-life balance going to look like for a lot of people? And I can't necessarily answer that question directly for you, but what I can say is that a lot of the invisible work, the invisible barriers, the invisible challenges that maybe happened within people's homes related to childcare or caring for the home or supporting your partner and their careers as well, a lot of that invisible work came to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what happened is that you had a lot more people saying, hey, at 10 a.m., I got to jump out for my kid's dentist appointment and I'll be right back. And that was sort of openly accepted as your reason.
But that was actually well planned. I mean, the other part of it, there's this door behind me. On many podcasts, a small child has come through that door.
Exactly.
And if you think pre-pandemic, there was that famous clip on the BBC. What I'm talking, like economists on the BBC.
Yeah.
Kid runs in, mom runs in after and drags the kid out as if he's about to club dad with a bat. And that just doesn't happen anymore. So, but that shift, that was a period in time. We had different restrictions. You're based in Canada, I'm in the United States. Different restriction to Canada versus the U.S. But there was that period where we're all in the same chair, as it were. That chair is in our home. Now it's kind of going, some people's chairs at home, some people's chairs back at the office. Some companies are more, tolerant of interruptions and people, either the child coming in or somebody else coming in or the worker going out. Where are we now when you think of, having done all that research back then? Where are we now? At least sort of, the most progressive companies, and, we know that the more regressive ones, but where are we now with those companies that are really trying to sort this out?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're starting to see, I think previously what you saw was a really strong dedication to being in the office, and a lot of the outside of work responsibilities were kind of invisible. But there's one stat that I heard recently, which I think is incredibly interesting, is that for fathers, something like 85+% of millennial fathers take part in changing their babies' diapers. Whereas 30 or 40 years ago, for a different generation, that was like a single-digit percentage point of fathers that were engaging in changing their babies' diapers.
But back then it was like 3% of fathers changed one diaper, like one diaper in the totality. Exactly. It wasn't like they were actively doing, like, I did it. That's one.
Yeah, and so I think what we're seeing now is whether you're being told to come back to the office or you're being allowed to work from home, I think that there was a narrative that is disproportionately affecting mothers because of the responsibilities they have outside of the workplace. And of course, mothers carry a huge load outside of the workplace. But I think what is happening is that you're seeing a lot more dads say, hey, I also want that work from home role. I also want that flexibility. And some organizations are offering that and some aren't. And the ones that aren't offering that flexibility, I think previously they might have had their pick at top talent because they pay a lot and they demand a lot. But I think a lot of that top talent is saying, hey, I don't want that anymore. I don't want to be in the office 60 hours a week, traveling to client sites, wearing a suit the entire time. And that's really going to mix up the talent pool and create a lot more challenges for companies that are trying to attract top talent.
This is an argument that I've been making, since I started the Company of Dads. I mean, there are three components of the Company of Dads: a media arm, a community platform, and this corporate engagement. And, doing work with employee resource groups and helping them understand why, giving more attention, more flexibility to men who are dads doesn't just help those men, it actually helps the entire workforce. It reduces some of the burden on women. But from the very beginning, I've been saying, look, just as you just said, the top talent is going to leave. And, we just watch what's happening at Twitter. People are just leaving Twitter. Like, I don't want to do that. To a lesser extent, less public, Goldman Sachs, whose CEO has really put a stake in the ground and said, you're going to return to the office. They're losing a lot of senior female executives who have an incredible pedigree and to go anywhere. And I say, it's your bottom 30%. You can tell them to do whatever the hell you want them to do. They're not going anywhere because nobody wants them. It's that top, 10, 20, 25% that have options. And, that's a question, like, we all know this, and any manager, should know this or has a sense of it intuitively. Why, when, top performers are saying, look, I had 2 years to have this reset. I'm a man, I'm a dad, I want to be involved. And hey, I'm a working mom and I want to have greater flexibility. Why would companies even resist? Is it some sort of, ingrained like anchoring bias or some sort of behavioral finance that says, I did it this way, you have to? Why would they even resist something that's, we all prove that white collar workers at least prove that it worked pretty well remotely?
Yeah. And so getting into the Design of Everyday Men report, we did a lot of research on the correlation between hours worked and objective output. Like, do people that work longer hours, do they actually perform better in the job? And there is research dating back decades that says that's simply not true, that there is a point of diminishing returns where the amount of hours that you're working can lead to exhaustion, can lead to just poorer performance, and that leads to mistakes being made. And so it can actually be detrimental to be working too many hours and not taking the breaks that you need. But for some reason, I actually spoke with an academic researcher, like a PhD in their field, who had done some of this workplace research, and she had told me this story about how they had analyzed a management consulting firm. And they had basically said that like hours worked do not correlate to better outcomes. And they presented that to the leadership of this organization. And the leadership's response was, well, maybe we just don't want those kinds of people working here that, don't want to work the super long hours. They kind of looked at the data and just completely ignored it. And it's a phenomenon that's kind of hard to give a why behind, but just the fact of the matter is that if you want to succeed in a traditional organization, the more you work and the more flexible you are to work whenever you're asked to, the faster you'll advance. And that's the thing that holds back a lot of mothers that have outside of work responsibilities, as we all know. And it's also the thing that keeps men from engaging in those outside of work responsibilities.
I mean, has COVID given us a reset? Has COVID allowed us to have this reset to rethink and to actually step back and look at the data and maybe make a data-driven decision?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the talk that I've heard, like the corporate execs coming out and the kind of things that they're saying to the employee base is what they want to promote. That's definitely where the narrative has gone. It's gone to maintaining flexibility, maintaining an allowance to take care of your personal life outside of work, and finding ways to make that flexible. One of the last things that I worked on about 12 months ago before I left Deloitte was this idea of the 4-day work week. And it was I won't get into too many details around it, but basically it was, at a global level, what would a 4-day work week look like? What use cases can we borrow from to see if it would work in a consulting type environment? And that was sort of all the rage. And you saw it over the last 12 months. You've seen, hardcore, not to use Elon Musk's term, but hardcore work environments that are moving towards a 4-day work week as becoming much more common. And so it's definitely happening. And I think that we're going to start seeing in the next year or two, those organizations that do move to the 4-day work week, are they maintaining or even improving their performance over time? My hypothesis is that they will. We'll see how it pans out.
Yeah, that's interesting. When you think about this, I'm not sure how the medical training works in Canada, but in the US, it's, sort of, resident based and they finish, medical school and then the residents go. And it used to be that the residents would just be ground down. They'd work these shifts, 24 plus hours. They'd be exhausted. And that was almost like a hazing ritual. And then, they realized that patients were not doing well with tired doctors. This is not a shock, but, if they could come to that realization in hospitals where it was literally life and death, you would think, why would, fill in the blank, XYZ manager, work better, over a sustained period of time on very little sleep. We all understand that sometimes you have to really put in extra hours to get the project done, but what about a sustained period of time? I love this concept. The 4-day week is interesting to me. You having sort of, flexibility, having almost like a parent bank of time. That's an idea I like a lot, where you can sort of, be a little more flexible. But there's one line in the report. There's several lines in the report. There's one I want to read to you, and I wanted to sort of unpack it a bit, because your kids now are what? They're 2 and 4, or am I making that?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, 2 4 kid. Okay, so mine are a little older. They're 5, 10, and 13. And this line here really struck out to me, and it's, quote, "Evidence shows that when men take more paternity leave, women are more likely to stay employed full-time, the wage gap decreases, and more women earn senior leadership positions on boards. For organizations, this means more gender equality in the workplace and greater competitiveness in today's diverse marketplace. For men, this means more freedom to express their whole self." Why is it, paternity leave itself that is so important? Does that set some marker for the rest of a child's life, or is it, some company that allows paternity leave and therefore is likely to allow parents to be, more flexible or more present for their kids as they get older?
Yeah, it's a great question. So that particular line, thinking of, it's funny that you picked that one out, because this journey for me into writing this Design of Everyday Men report started back in 2018 when my wife Erin was pregnant with our first child. And I was thinking a lot about what would my role as a father look like as a management consultant in my career, and then just what does it look like within our family. And so I started to do more research on what is the impact of parental leave. I worked in a corporate Toronto, corporate Canada environment that's not too different from corporate USA as well, corporate America, where men simply did not take any parental leave or very, very little. And so I started doing research on societies or countries where men did take more parental leave. So specifically Scandinavian countries like Iceland and Norway and Sweden, where men had more access.
It's always a Scandinavian country.
Yeah.
They just look bad.
Yeah. And so in those countries, men do take a larger share of parental leave overall. And what you see in those countries is also, it's correlation, not necessarily causation, but the correlation is wage gaps are smaller, gender equality index is more equal, more women in state employed full time. Having myself taken 6+ months of leave for both of my children, so 2 times over, my answer to your question more specifically is that there is a set of core skills that you learn in those early years of your child's life. Simple things like, if your child's going down for a nap after lunch and it's 11 a.m., what is the chain of events to get your child to that nap? Lunch times, changing diapers, doing whatever else needs to be done.
It's operation management. That's what it is,
exactly.
Man. You can take
It's
corporate skill.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's this multitasking, the buzz of the mental load, I like to call it as well. All these things that go on inside your head when you're alone at home with the kid and your wife is out or your partner, I should say, is out, and their career. And in my personal experience, other people can disagree with me, and that's totally fine. In my personal experience, a minimum of about 3 months at home with your, 1-year-old or 1.5-year-old was what it took for me to sort of feel like I could run at the same speed that my partner could. She had spent the first year at home with our child. I had spent, months 12 through 18 at home with our child. And it wasn't until I'd gone through about 3 months of that on my own where I was like, okay, I feel like I've got a handle on it now. And here we are when our kids are 2 and 4 years old. And I think we can more fluidly hand off different responsibilities. My wife has gone this weekend for, a girls' trip. So I've got the kids, from when I pick them up in an hour until Monday morning, no problem.
Yeah.
But for a lot of couples, that might be a problem. Heterosexual couples where men and women take different roles. So my answer to your question, and I know that I'm biased in this, and I come from a country where men do have a lot of access to parental leave, is that it is about parental leave, because that's when the foundations around who's responsible for what get established. And if you as a dad take on some of that, you're creating a more equal environment where your partner can succeed in their careers and you can succeed in your career.
I don't disagree with what you said, but I am going to challenge you.
Sure.
Just as being a little further along in the parenting journey. And, when I look back on those early years, in comparison, they were easy. And they were easy because they're predictable for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And a child has a schedule, and a child, has certain hours of the day where she is in school, or certain hours a day when she is napping. And, come the weekend, if you and your wife are there together, unless you totally screw this up, you're going to get a couple of hours break in the middle of the day because the kids are going to be napping. And I think what throws a wrench in it, and which is why I'm, obviously I'm who the hell would be anti-paternity leave? I mean, that's ridiculous. I'm pro-paternity leave, but I think it doesn't tell the whole story. It's a start, particularly in a country like the United States. It's a necessary start. And we have an average of men take on average 1 day a week, 1 day of paternity leave, which is absurd because I took 4 weeks. And so that really skewed it. So how many are taking 0 to have 1 be the average? This is research from this professor, Kristen Shockley at the University of Georgia. Insane. But when your kids get older, the variability gets inserted into there. And like as a lead dad who worked full time for 25 years as a journalist, the majority at the New York Times, my wife had her own company. Certainty is easy to parent around. Variability is impossible. Sometimes you get lucky. It's kind of like going to a casino. Sometimes you pull the handle and hey, look at that, you just won $100. Mm-hmm. But most of the time it's unpredictable. And this is why I wonder, what companies can do to help, workers with 10-year-olds, with 13-year-olds, with 17-year-olds. I mean, the problems just change. There's a phrase here in the States, little kids, little problems, big kids, big problems. And, I did an early podcast with Dr. Dana Susskind, who wrote a book called Parent Nation. And we talked about, we've gotten to the stage in society where we can put in our calendar preschool graduation, or ballet recital, or baseball game. And everybody, totally got to go to that, man. Come on, go to that. Like, okay, you got to, come on, pat you on the back. Go ahead, Dad. But if you put in that calendar, mental health break with teenager, walk with 10-year-old who's being bullied, I don't think it's looked at the same way. And I just wonder, I don't mean to put you on the spot, and I'm just kind of, offering my opinion, but I mean, is there any, evidence? Got a lot of hope, but is there any evidence to back up the hope that companies might realize that it's not even an 18-year journey. It's a 22-year, 25-year journey. Those kids getting out of college and getting on their own. Any evidence that companies are getting more aware of those challenges that persist way beyond, a couple years old?
Yeah, I mean, to answer your question directly, is there any evidence of that? I mean, I can't point to anything right now, but again, going back to our Design of Everyday Men report, one of our key findings was, how do we better enable men to engage in those types of like childcare, essentially family care activities that you just talked about, like taking a walk with your bullied 10-year-old. How do we enable men and everyone to do that more freely? And one of the things that we heard from the men that we interviewed was that they look to the people that are in positions of power, the people that have status within the organization, the CEO, the executives, the people above them, and they say, or they see what kind of behaviors are they engaging in. If they do it, then I can do it too. It's very much a role modeling, creating space and allowance for people to do these types of things. And so what that makes me think about is that you know, we live in a patriarchal society where men do have a lot of those senior roles within organizations. It's just a fact of our economy. And so those are the men that have the power and have the status. I personally would call on them to really engage in those types of behaviors and create space around it. And so it should be the people with the most amount of power and status within an organization that are saying, you know what, I'm going to take off time this afternoon to take a walk with my 10 or 15-year-old because it's important. And if they can show that kind of role modeling, you'll see it disseminate down into the rest of the organization.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one of the things, I wanted to touch on, because you talk about 4 themes in the report around men's experience in business, and 3 are fairly what I would call individualistic, but it's that one there, which you just talked about, you call it in the report, show me it's okay. And essentially it's that, that modeling. And I think it's interesting you went for like senior leadership. There's a part of me that's more optimistic with the emerging leaders, that kind of, if I had a tagline, it'd be, change starts in the middle, because we all suffer from sort of that confirmation bias when we've gone to the top. But when you think about, solutions, one that you offered was for companies and business leaders to rethink the expectations for success. Where is that going to come from, and what's going to drive it? Is a driver going to be what you talked about earlier on, the very top performers demanding more, or what's going to drive that rethinking of the expectations for success?
Yeah, I think that's what you said is exactly what's going to happen. So going back to the previous part of our conversation around, some organizations are telling people to come back into the office and go back to sort of our old way of working. Some organizations are allowing for more flexibility. And I think what it's going to take is another piece of the puzzle for sure is people that are those emerging leaders, those mid-level people that are high potential to say, I'm just not going to work in that kind of environment.
Right.
And
and set that example.
Yeah.
Like I'm not going to do that. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, I mean, I don't want to speak ill of any of my past career experiences, but I will say that, management consulting is an incredibly demanding industry, right? And so there has to be a point where you ask yourself, like, do I want to keep working at 11 p.m. on a Thursday? Or do I want to say, at 5 p.m., that's when my computer closes, my kids get picked up from daycare and we have a family dinner and I won't get back online until, 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. the next day. And so you have to draw lines for yourself, I think. And for me, I think a lot about, privilege as well. So I'm like highly educated, 10 years experience as management consultant, cisgender straight white guy. Like I've got all the things going for me that I could possibly have going for me. If it's not people like me sticking their necks out there and saying, hey, I'm not going to do this thing, I'm going to walk away from this because it's just not right for me and my family, I think it's those types of people that really need to stand up and say, we're not going to do this anymore. And I think we're starting to get there. I mean, the millennial dads changing diapers, it's a simple example, but I think it's indicative of a more engaged involvement in parenting. I've seen a lot more just consciousness around your career is not everything. Your career is a part of you for sure, but it's not everything. And so let's not sacrifice everything just for that, jump in your career to the next level.
Yeah. You did something twice that is pretty impressive. And I know a lot of dads and moms in the US probably wish they did that. And one, you took 6 months off when your first child was a year old. We mentioned that at the top, but then, during the pandemic, you took time off from work to be with your family, to all kind of be in that together. How did you decide to do that? And on the other side of that, what was it like re-entering work after you had done it?
So taking time off during the pandemic, the backstory is that my employer was offering voluntary work reductions to help offset some of the headcount costs that we're maintaining through the downturn and the pandemic. And so I put my hand up to take 3 months off at the time, which just happened to correlate perfectly to when our second child was born. So it sort of became like a mini parental leave, but also our child was born in May 2020. So peak pandemic, you weren't allowed to visit other people. They say it takes a village to raise a child, right? Our village was gone. It was just my wife and I and our 2 kids. Daycare was closed. So it was, to be honest, I would say that, you know, in the spirit of trying to be vulnerable as a man, because a lot of times we're not vulnerable about our emotions, like incredibly difficult. I would say that men can have postpartum depression after a child is born as well. That's clinically proven. I would probably put myself in that category. I would say that there was a degree of clinical depression around that time, from the pandemic. I personally found that with our first child, I was quite involved. I was doing some formula bottle feedings throughout the week. We were sort of handing things off. My wife was breastfeeding, so she was taking on the bulk of it, but I was still involved a little bit. With our second child, just by default, I took on more responsibility with the older child, and she took more responsibility with the younger child. And so that made me feel like the bond that I was building with my younger child was just more difficult for me to bring together. And so even though it was 3 months off, it was certainly difficult. And then I took another parental leave later on in the year when my wife went back to work, and added on another 5 or 6 months to that parental leave later on. But coming back into the workplace was really tough, because I came back in saying to myself, I only want to work, 9 to 5, so to speak. I'll do the job, I'll do it well, but if they say jump, I'm not going to say how high. I'm going to say, this is how high I'll jump.
Why jump now? I'm perfectly grounded.
Yeah. And so that was my mindset. And I sort of experimented with, can I work a 9 to 5 in this type of environment? I think the answer was no. And so it came to a point for me where it was like, all right, I need to step away from this, because I just can't I can't be the kind of parent that I want to be in this environment. It just doesn't work. And a lot of people, what happens is they get paid caregivers. They'll bring a nanny on or something to help fill that gap. That's a perfectly viable solution that people can do. It just wasn't what we wanted to do for our family. And so I was very fortunate that I had this startup, Moosh, to fall into. And so Moosh had kind of been bubbling up on the side for a year or so at that point, and it was sort of time to take a full-time jump into entrepreneurship. And that's obviously meant financial struggles for sure, but it's also provided the ultimate flexibility, because I'm self-employed now, so I can do the 3:30 pickup. I can do the someone has a cold, needs to come home from school, I can go do that pickup. I took them for their COVID shots yesterday, so it gave me the flexibility to do those kinds of things.
Eric, this has been wonderful. Thank you for joining me on the Company of Dads podcast. I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you today.
Yeah, thank you, Paul.